Okay, yeah, thank you and welcome to my online presentation, my lecture today. My name is Alexander Rammert. I'm a researcher and lecturer at the Chair of Integrated Transport Planning at the Technical University of Berlin. And today I want to talk to you guys about planning mobilities. In my opinion, it's a new way of thinking about mobility and the transportation sector as a whole. And when we start to integrate mobility in our perspectives on planning and on transportation planning, it opens new way to improve the whole system. So about this theme, I want to go with you through four major points. The first one is the motivation behind it and why we need to think about mobility in the first place. There, I want to discuss with you what is the status quo of the transportation planning and how it comes that we need to think different than in the past. In the second part, I will talk a little bit more specific about the mobility itself. I think mobility is a nice concept, but it's really undefined. There's a lot of different understanding of mobility, so I think it's really important to talk about the mobility as a word, as a concept for us. And then after we discuss this or have a clear idea what is mobility, then we can start to think about how we plan mobilities. And that's the last part. And the fourth part, I want to discuss the consequences of this for the transportation planning as a whole. So how can mobility enrich the planning processes, the thinking processes, so that the future of transportation processes can be improved. But first, let's start at the beginning, why we need to think about mobility as transportation planners, as decision makers in transportation. Why is mobility something we have to acknowledge? And to make this argument, I want to start first with a little history of transportation planning. Of course, one of you knows the basics, but I think it's important to look back at the classical transportation planning to generate an understanding what's happened and what we need to change. And first, like 150 years ago, transportation planning was mainly infrastructure planning. It was all about building infrastructures. In the beginning, of course, the railways, but later the street and car infrastructure. For example, here the picture of the first German Autobahn. And so the transportation planner was mainly occupied with building infrastructures, building new routes, new infrastructures to accommodate for the growing traffics. After a short time of purely infrastructure-focused planning, we see another trend in transportation planning, and that's about rebuilding cities. It started in the second half of the 20th centuries, and now it's not enough to just build infrastructures for the growing traffics, but also to rebuild the cities, to create new city districts. There's one concept we call the Charta of Athens, where there was like functional segregation of cities, so that the uses like sleep, like work, leisure, sleeping were in different part of city districts, and so infrastructure planning and part of the city planning grew together and rebuild our cities to accommodate for the growing traffic, for car traffic in special. And then the last part of history of transportation planning, in my opinion, was with the growing computation and digitalization, we start to organize traffic. Now, even after we built all this infrastructure, we rebuilt all the cities, the traffic was still growing. We still had issues with traffic jams. So we needed new ways, mainly with technology, to organize the traffic, to make it more efficient, to create better flows. So this was the last part, and all of these parts of transportation planning are really important even today. So now that we look back the last 100 years of the classical transportation planning, let's look next where this brought us. What is the status quo of the transport system today? And first, we of course have to talk about the ecological consequences. So first, in the transport sector is one of the big 5 emitters of climate gas, especially CO2. And the problem, or the huge problem with the transportation sector, is that it not only didn't decrease his emissions as much as the other sector, as you can see in this diagram, that only goes until 2014, but that's the breaking point. After that, of the 2013, it even increased in emission. So there you can see how special the transport sector is, that it has a especially big problem to achieving its goals in emission, in climate emissions. Secondly, we have another huge environmental problem with the air pollution. So that's not about the climate, that's more about people and nature. And we see the extreme version of this with the smog, with the huge pollution, especially in cities where the traffic induces a lot of negative effects on the people and on the living in dense areas. And last is also a point that's not much talked about, the land consumptions. We every day, every hour, there gets more and more land consumed for the building of new infrastructures, and especially in city spaces, or in like, for example, Europe, where we have not as much space, and at some other parts in the world, it's getting more and more a problem to accommodate for all this space traffic needs. Especially the motorized traffic, when we think about parking spaces, and we view some of the cities, we can see how much space there's waste for just standing vehicles, just standing still, place we could use for living, for building resident houses, etc. So that's some problems we have in the ecological sense, but we also have social consequences of traffic and transport, and this is on a human level. We have huge induced stress and illness levels from the air pollution we already talked about, but also from the noise pollution the traffic induces. So we have a lot about, there's really good research on this topic, a lot of lost years in human lives, lost to illnesses, traffic induced illnesses that are a bad factor for the life of the people. And secondly, we have another point of time consumption. I think it's also a really interesting part of the negative consequences of the traffic and transport system, and that we spend more time in traffic. And for example, if we look at some cities in Africa, in Cairo, for example, there's like the average travel time every day to get to work and back are 3 hours. And when you think about that, every human there that works there has on average spent 3 hours a day in traffic. And maybe you know from your own experience how much time you spend in traffic. That's a huge factor for the global population. We spend so much time in traffic, and this would be time we could spend otherwise. So there's also a factor we have to acknowledge when it's about transportation planning. And last but not least, we all have the social consequence of exclusion and segregation, especially in car-dependent resident areas, where for people who don't want to drive cars or can't drive cars because there's children, or because they're impaired or have some other issues, they are directly excluded from taking part in public life if there is no public transport available. So we have a huge factor that the transport system has on exclusion and segregation. So we not only plan the transport itself when we are transport planning, we are planning society as a whole. And that is the status quo we have now with transport system, and many of the factors or consequences getting worse now. So what can we learn from this short look back at history, the history of transportation planning? We see what the limits is. So we have a lot of limits in transportation planning, so that we see we have to change something. So some major points to take away are we focused only on infrastructure and technology. The last decades, we only looked at different infrastructures, and later we started to look at the different vehicles. And even now, it's all about new autonomous vehicles or hyperloop infrastructure. The thinking starts at infrastructure and technology, but never really acknowledges the human. Secondly, we have a long history of neglecting the negative effects. These consequences I showed you are not new. We know about them for over 50 years. And also many of the transportation planners know about them for a lot of, for many decades. But they never implemented this knowledge in their new way of thinking, in new measures and new concepts. And so we have still the increasing negative consequences today because the planners and decision makers couldn't implement these negative effects in new approaches. And we also have a domination of quantitative indicators, and that's derived from the first point where there is a focus on infrastructure and technology. Of course, it's like in natural sciences or engineering, it's all about numbers. It's like traffic flow, speed, travel times. So this was the focus for a huge part and still is in transportation planning. And qualitative indicators like quality of life, happiness, different aesthetic indicators are not really important in the history of transportation planning. So we can subsume that the human factors fall short in all of this history of transportation planning. And when we think about what the transportation system is for, it's for the human mainly. So that's a little bit strange. And that's why we can derive that up until now, transportation planning failed to meet its set goals of creating a sustainable and socially just transport system. And at this point, I would argue with the concept of mobility, there is a new idea, a new perspective of thinking that can help us overcome this negative histories or neglecting of negative effects and not focusing on the human being. And that's why I want to talk with you about mobility as a new approach to tackle these challenges. So now you might ask, what is mobility? And we could also discuss this if we were able to sitting together here. But what always is the case is that everyone has a different perspective on mobility. Everyone has different pictures what mobility is. And that's why I think it's important to first discuss what our different views on mobility are. So then we can finally derive a concept of mobility that we want to implement in planning, because that's a huge challenge for mobility. Traffic is clearly defined and space or infrastructure is clearly defined, but what is mobility is not clearly defined. And that's why it's so hard to implement it into planning and decision making. So first, I want to show you some pictures or some narratives of mobility that we a lot about in our research life, but also you may know many of these pictures from your life as a transportation planner. So one is, if you ask like the classical automotive sector workers what they think mobility is, they will tell you about, it's about auto mobility, it's about sharing mobility, the future of mobility is about sharing economy, new systems, new mobility innovations. Then we also have another part of planners who think mobility more as an infrastructure. Like I told you in the history, an infrastructure project, for them mobility is like new ways of moving around, for example, the Hyperloop or new infrastructure projects, new maglevs innovation. So the focus here is clearly on technological innovation and technological advancement to create a new mobility. Then we also have in the digitalization sector, have we an understanding of mobility as interconnectivity, interchangeable car-to-X communication are some keywords there. So for them, it's also technologically focused, but not as much on infrastructure, more on digitalization and interconnectivity. And also some engineers understand mobility as new vehicle innovation. So there is the autonomous driving or even the flying taxis we can hear so much about. And so you see a lot of different ideas what mobility is, how mobility could look like. And I would argue these pictures I showed you now are like concepts of the past of mobility, even though that seem a lot about innovation and technological progress. I think the way of thinking that produced this kind of narratives or pictures are the thinking of the past I showed you in the first part. So now I want to show you an alternative thinking, how we can perceive mobility. And this other narrative of mobility starts with a completely different pictures where you don't see any cars in the first place. And you also see not the classical infrastructure you would connect with the transport sector. So I would argue that mobility is more about the people in the first place, and secondly, the spaces the people occupy. So mobility in this narrative is about living spaces, cityscapes, and the places the people live in. And for example, when we also look at the vehicles or modes of transportation, then the mobility-oriented view would be how can these different transportation modes can coexist, how they can influence each other, how they can supplement each other, where it's not about how I can build this infrastructure here or there, but instead how can they be combined in shared spaces, for example. Or it's about also rebuilding city, but now it's rebuilding back again. For example, in this picture, this is from Paris, where they reuse the street on the Seine River, and now it's for people. It's a walking space. So they reused this car infrastructure and made it an infrastructure for people, an infrastructure for living, and that's about mobility. And lastly, we also have some, not only technological innovation, but also social innovations. How can we use the transport systems that we have and improve it? For example, here, this picture from Berlin, where there is a concept for a bicycle way under the metro, so that in bad weather, the cyclists don't get wet. So that's a whole different idea of innovation and to think differently about mobility as a whole. So now this was a little bit broad. I showed you some pictures first, but now I want to get a little bit more into detail into what exactly we define as mobility, so we can start to plan it afterward. So first, I already said it, it's about the human being, the individual. So when we want to find mobility, we first have to look at the individual. And we couldn't say that every individual has different needs and needs satisfactions. And most of the time we can satisfy our needs at home. So we start to make traffic related decisions. Yes. And these decisions create traffic in a material space, also participation opportunities in social space. For example, if I have the need for eating a pizza, maybe I could drive in a city and go to a restaurant, but I could also order a pizza. So bring me the pizza at home. Or maybe I have a pizza in the refrigerator and I just have to go out and put it in the oven and I don't produce traffic at all. And with this example, you can see how the traffic-related decision of the individuals impact the transport sector. So in the first example, you would produce traffic yourself because you drive there for the restaurant. In the second example, you would induce traffic because you don't go out yourself, but someone else has to drive to you to get a pizza. And in the third example, you don't produce traffic at all. So for the classic transportation planner, this last example wouldn't exist because he only cares when it's traffic in the first place. And the mobility perspective offers you to look at the stages before the traffic-related decisions happen. So when we ask what defines the traffic-related decisions, we can bring in the concept of space of opportunity. So every human being has a space of opportunity, and that's the reason why he decides to eat pizza outside or to order the pizza in this example. Yeah, and the space of opportunity, that's what we call the mobility. And mobility is a totally different concept from traffic. It's inner individual and therefore in before the traffic-related decisions. And now we get to the interesting parts that, of course, the mobility, the space of opportunity is influenced on the one hand by spatial economic influences, on the other hand by social cultural influences, but I will talk a little bit more about this in the next parts. So to sum up, mobility is first subjective. As you can see, mobility is inside every one of us. So every one of us has his own different space of opportunity. So we can't watch from the outside and derive what the mobility is, as we can do it for traffic. We just sit there and measure traffic. We can't do the same with mobility. So we need totally different instruments and methods. Secondly, mobility is potential. Mobility is not the movement itself, not about the traffic itself, but the space of opportunity that comes before, that determines how we move around, if we move at all. Yeah, that's all as part of the mobility. So we can say in the end, mobility is human. It's a typical human thing. And so our final definition for mobility is that mobility describes the space of opportunities a single individual has to reach its desired destinations. So that's a quite theoretical or scientific approach. That's why I want to show you in two examples what this means for, or what the consequences are for this understanding for some examples. And one example is a daily suburban commuter. That's a classical figure we have all over the world that lives in the suburban areas of big cities. And second example is an inner city student. We also find this kind of humans all over the world where they live in the inner city parts and maybe are studying at the local university. And when we look at the first example, we see, or we can argue the daily suburban commuter drives every day 1 hour to work and back. He also needs the car or needs to drive to get his basic daily needs. So to the grocery store or to the cinema or to visiting friends, he always has to take his car and drive a couple of minutes or even an hour. And lastly, he also maybe has family members who can't drive themselves, speaking children. So he maybe also has to drive the children to school, to sports, to leisure activities. So as you can see, there's a lot of dependence on the car, but also a lot of need for time, because every satisfaction is only can be satisfied by, or every need can only be satisfied by car usage. The other example would be the inner city students. He walks only 5 minutes to the university because he lives nearby. He maybe don't has a car of himself and not has a lot of money, but he has a lot of options for different grocery stores. Can also walk to the next grocery stores. He has a lot of restaurants and bars around, and he not only has a lot of options for different locations for satisfaction of his needs, but he also has a lot of different options how he gets there. He can walk, but maybe when it's raining, he takes a car sharing, for example, or the metro, the public transport, or he has a new bike. So when he feels like it, he can use his bike. But when he breaks his leg, for example, he still can use other modes of transport. He's not dependent on one mode of transport, how the daily suburban commuter is. So with these two examples, we now can look at how the space of opportunity of each of this individual is. And we can argue with this points that the first example, the daily suburban commuter, has a small space of opportunity because he drives around every day, and he has to take a lot of time to get to work, and he also needs a lot of time to get around, to get his needs satisfied. He has therefore a small space of opportunity, and that leads to low mobility. And inner city students, on the other hand, because he has so many options, how he gets to his destination, and also how he satisfies his needs, or which transport modes he uses, he has a large space of opportunity and therefore a high mobility. And with this example, you can see that the mobility is totally different from the transport itself, so and the traffic. The first example, of course, produces a lot of traffic. He a lot of distances, but that's not about mobility. Mobility is the space of opportunity, not the traffic produced. So now we have a basic understanding what mobility is. Now the next important question for us planners, of course, is how we can plan this mobility. And I want to start with you with 3 basic steps. We have a lot of different sectors. It's about integrated planning, and these 3 steps are knowledge, goals, and concepts. And that's a basic principle that before you can plan something, of course, you need knowledge. What is the status quo? What we have? What is this the current situation? Then we need goals. Of course, if we want to plan, we need some goal to work towards. If we want to change the current situation, and in which direction should we change it? And last but not least, of course, we need a concept, so different strategy, but also concrete measures, how we influence this kind of, how we can influence the status quo to reach the desired goal. So that's the 3 integral parts for every planning sector, from spatial planning, environmental planning, climate planning, etc. And now we can summarize this for mobility. So first, we need the knowledge about mobilities. We have to acknowledge what the space of opportunities is for the different individual, and then we can start to change this, to plan it, to influence this. But first, we need the knowledge. And secondly, of course, we need defined goals, and that's also really hard to come by in mobility. So what is the goal for mobility? Should it be to maximize everything? Should it be a lower limit on the space of opportunity? But we, of course, need defined goals so that we can work towards them. And last, we have the concepts to influence mobility, and these are also really special because they're not like this classical and transportation planning or infrastructure. They are more than infrastructure, as you can see from the different factors that influences the mobility and the transport-related decisions. And there are many interesting new ways of influencing how people derive in this traffic-related or transport-related decisions. So let's look first at the first step, the knowledge step. And here I created a system of understanding or better visualizing mobility. But it's now a little bit scientific again. But I will argue that mobility is influenced by 2 or 4 major factors that we can see in this 2 dimension we've seen before. So in the material space, we first have the spatial structures. And of course, every one of you knows the spatial structures you have at home or at work that surrounds you, and what is the infrastructure, where are your destinations. So all the spatial factors are influencing, of course, your space of opportunity. Secondly, in the material space, we have the socio-demographic prerequisite. And there are like health and constitutional factors, like what is your health like? Can you walk? Can you see? Are your mobility impaired? And this has, of course, huge consequences for the space of opportunity, because if you can't walk, you can't use some infrastructure like stairs, for example. So there's where the concept of design for all comes from. But not only health and constitution, but also financial factors, like how much money or how much financial capital do the individual have? Can they pay for the mobility they need? And this is also some individual factors that influences the space of opportunity. On the social space, we have the social structures first. And there are more like, what is the state constitution at? So maybe there are some support of low-income households that give you some basic mobility guarantee. Or for example, in this picture, we could see a student ticket, and you find it in a lot of cities around the world, where there is a free ticket for students because they don't have as much money to pay for public transport. And this also have a huge influence of the space of opportunity. And the fourth part is the most interesting part, I think. It's the social cultural prerequisites, because they also have a huge impact on the space of opportunity we have. For example, in this picture, I showed flygskam. That's a Swedish word for fly shaming. And that's an interesting concept that there is some cultural norms that influences the mobility behavior of some people, that they, for example, in this example, don't take the airplane. So for them, the objective space of opportunity, maybe there's an airport 5 minutes by, but they don't use it and take the train for like 2 days or something like that, because their cultural norms decided that for them. But we also have it with cars, where cars are like status symbols for many people. So it's really important to have a car, and therefore for them it's really hard maybe to drive a bicycle, because in their cultural circle and their cultural norms, it's important to show their status with a car. So if we want to plan mobilities, we have to think about all of these factors. But that's only the objective part. I already told you mobility is subjective. So in the end, before we can talk about mobility, we also have to look at the perception. And we have on the one hand, the spatial demographic perception. That's how we view our environment, and it's prominent in bicycle infrastructure, that we have some bicycle infrastructure on the streets, for example. But some people find it really nice and drive there a lot, but other individuals may find it really dangerous for them. They have a subjective insecurity there, so they don't use this infrastructure. So it's really important for us to also look at the perceptions of this spatial structures and social demographic prerequisites. But the same is true for social cultural perceptions. Not everyone is influenced by flygskam, so we can see, everyone can see for himself how impactful this cultural narratives are for them. So of course, the objective space of opportunity is only the outer part. When we talk about mobility, we also have to look at the perceptions and the subjective space of opportunity. So, and this was quite theoretical again, and I want to show you that we have some successful project with local administration to implement this knowledge into the transportation planning processes. And one example is project Mobilbericht, mobility report, where we work together with a local administration here in Berlin, with the district, and there we use a combination of different methods, quantitative methods, qualitative methods, and to work together with people, but also with impaired persons, for example, or students or pupils, to get an understanding what are their constraints, what are their space of opportunity is. And in the end, there is a report on local mobility in this district, and this helps the planners to understand mobility in the first place, so they can then develop and plan it. And something similar we had done in Berlin and Hamburg as well. There we have an extensive qualitative research to identify mobility barriers, and this was focused on low-income households, because they are also really interesting how their life situation influences their space of opportunity, and how we as planners can better understand these challenges and barriers and accommodate for that in planning of mobility. So that's only two examples how we go forth to generate this knowledge on mobility together with local administration, but also, of course, with the local stakeholders. Then when we have the knowledge about mobility, the next thing we have to talk about is the goals. And of course, this question, why are goals important? I would always say, without goals, planning is just muddling through. It can also be a strategy, but especially with this huge challenges we have, like climate change or inequality, globalization, etc., we can't plan anymore without goals. So it's really important to have goals for strategic approaches to strategically change systems to better suits these goals and make it future-proof in this kind of sense. And with mobility, I want to show you what the difference can be in perspective to transport-oriented goals. So in transport-oriented planning, in the classical approach, we have, for example, the goal of reducing travel times. That's about increasing the speeds, faster trains, faster road infrastructure. But the mobility-oriented goal would be reducing urban sprawl, because they look at the problem, why we need faster travel times in the first place. And that's why and then we can see that the problem is the more and more dispersed locations and dispersed destinations. So a different approach would be just creating denser structures, shorter ways, so people can get to their destinations also faster, but not in the means of travel time, in the means of distance. So the mobility-oriented goal would be reducing urban sprawl. Then another example is improving connectivity, also a really important goal we have in transportation planning all over the world. So where it's about making connections with air modes of transport, but also with rails, etc. And the mobility-oriented goal would look at the space of opportunity, would look at the people. What is the barriers for entry for them? Do they need just the connections, or do they need accessibility in the first place so that they can use this kind of services? And it's not only about physical accessibility, but also psychological, like understanding the transport system, getting information, how they can move around in cities or different regions. So it's more about understanding and perception of the people itself than the connectivity on the transport system. And last, we have, of course, the really important goal all over the world, creating economic growth. And it's really intertwined with transportation planning. Infrastructure and infrastructure development is still seen as one of the main driving factors of economic growth. And of course, that's not including the people in the first place. So if we would look at the mobility-oriented goal, we would ask ourselves, why is it that we need economic growth? And then we would argue, yeah, that more person can live a better life and have a better well-being. And then we can argue, okay, then let's look at well-being in the first place. So mobility-oriented goal would be how we can improve the well-being of the citizens, of the inhabitants of our region. And then we look at different measures we can use. And maybe economic growth is one of them, but maybe there's also different approaches. So with that, I want to show you how mobility offers a different perspective on goal setting, on goal criteria for the whole transportation planning. And lastly, we need concepts. Of course, I could talk hours about different new ideas and concepts we have for influencing mobility. I think many of you know yourself many different concepts. I differ in 6 major fields for these concepts, and I think it's important to look always at all of these 6 fields, because they influence each other and have really good synergies when we use different approaches. So we saw the classic transportation planning mainly was in structural and organizational influence or concepts measures. But when we talk about mobility, we now see we have more options. We also have regulative options. So some laws, how we influence the mobility behavior. Then we have financial options like subsidizing and taxing mobility. That's also really important to influence the traffic-related decisions. But we also have more soft measures like communicative measures, where we try to influence the social cultural perceptions we talked about, or this informational level where we bring more information to the people, more knowledge, so they can better decide how they want to move, how they use their space of opportunity. So these are some main approaches for different concepts. Of course, in the short amount of time, we can't go any deeper in that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of possibilities to create new and innovative concepts for influencing mobilities. So to sum up, the foundation for planning mobilities is first, we need knowledge about mobility. Secondly, we need defined goals for our mobility. And last, we need effective measures for mobilities. And that's the foundation for planning mobilities. And to get it then implemented in the practical approaches, we need frameworks, tools, and participation. And that's the last part I want to talk with you about. With all this knowledge we now have about planning mobilities, what is the consequences for the classical transportation planning, so that we can improve the basic concepts and make a more future-proof, progressive transportation planning. So some of these things we learned, we first heard about transportation planning is in dire need for a normative framework. We saw that transportation planning just didn't care for the societal, for the political goals, and just did its own thing. So in future, we have to better interconnect these two, that the transportation planning is not segregated from politicals and like economical goals. And so we need a better normative integration. Secondly, we see that people and stakeholders have to be included for future-proof planning, especially with mobility. I showed you that mobility is something, human, something that is classical for people. So if you want to plan it and change it and make it future-proof, of course, we have to talk with the humans in the first place, and secondly, also have to integrate them in the planning processes to make a better planning. Then we also have that mobility itself have to be an integral part of the classical transportation planning. Yeah, and I showed it to you in the history part that mobility wasn't a factor there, and still isn't in many places. It's talk about new autonomous car driving technologies or new infrastructures. But if the people need new infrastructures, if the humans need autonomous driving, that's just not the question. Yeah, and so mobility have to be included in all these questions and goal settings of transportation planning, and has to be an integral part. And we also see, and we have the same problem at climate change, for example, traffic and mobility don't end at borders. Yeah, so it's not enough to only work out local concepts on how to improve and plan mobility, but we also have to cooperate with our neighbors on the local level, but also on the national level. And for that, we created the concepts of, or it was like created 50 years ago. I think it's quite old. The concept of integrated transportation planning. So that's also what my chair is called after. So the concept of integrated transportation planning, it's a holistic approach to this transportation problems. Yeah? And I think you have an understanding now and also a motivation why we have to take this new concept and approach this. And for us, the human being is the starting point of all the concept. Yeah? When you could argue that for the historic transportation planning, it was like the infrastructure or the technology. For integrated transportation planning, it's the human being. We always start at the human being. What are their needs? What are their desires? And how we can improve it with transportation, yeah? Not the other way around. Then it's also about cooperation. It's about cooperation of different institutions. It's about stakeholders, but also citizens. As we can see, it's really important to include all these different groups to create better and future-proof planning concepts. And for that, we have four levels of integration. As you can see on the right, it's like the normative integration, the political integration, the sectoral integration, and the spatial integrations. And we argue that when planning gets all these integration factors right, then we have a really successful and future-proof planning structure. And we showed it in many projects that this was indeed the case in different countries and different cities. So if we can integrate all of these four levels, then we can have a successful transportation planning system. And I want to show you shortly these four integration levels in more detail. So first we have the normative integration, and that is the problem I was talking about before, that we don't, or in the history, we didn't acknowledge the goals, the broader goals like well-being and climate change for transportation sector. So the normative integration is about a transparent connection between the normative framework above until the concepts, the local concepts, so that every citizen, every stakeholder, every decision maker can make their own transparent connections between what is the normative framework, what are some goal criteria, for example, CO2 emissions, then what are the strategies to get to these criteria, and which concepts do different sectors provide to get these goal criteria done. And there we also need this information and knowledge to make these connections between these different levels or steps of planning. So the goal is here to have also a foundation for interdisciplinary planning, that the normative framework, of course, is not only for transportation, but they are more brighter for the whole society. And then each sector, each different discipline can work their own strategies and concepts and measures to influence the system as a whole to reach the common goals of which this normative framework provides. So the normative integration is a really important part, especially for transportation planning, to get it more in line with the views and aims and goals of the global society. Then some examples how we can approach this integration in practical approaches is first the mobility law in Germany. We have that here on a federal level in Berlin. Since 2008, there is a law on mobility, and also this special understanding of mobility. I showed you they acknowledge that mobility is about space of opportunities, and with this law they have some normative frameworks how mobility planning can go ahead here in Berlin. So we have here a long-term framework for that. But also we have an example in France with the mobility plans. This is also really interesting because it's not only on a state level, but it's more on a local level where not only the administration, but also companies have to create this mobility plans, they call them, and there they have to reflect on their traffic induction, how they influence the mobility, and how this is in line with the broader goals of France. So it's also a really interesting part to integrate all of the different stakeholders in planning. So the second integration level is the political integration, and here it's all about participation. Yeah, I was already telling you about how important it is to get the human perspectives, but not only from the citizens, but also from different planning actors and different political actors, local governance structures, NGOs. They all have to be included in different parts of the processes to create a more resilient, stronger, and future-proof strategies. So the political integration, there is the goal to get a common understanding in between these different ministries, these different planning actors, so that they can all work together and work out their differences and different approaches. And there we have also some examples from some of our projects here in Berlin, where we included local residents, but also the local politicians. For example, with the politicians, we did focus group discussions where we talked about the goals for mobility. Then the knowledge on mobility we created with community mappings, where we worked together with different citizens groups, with students, and then we got good insight how they see their space of opportunity, but also with participatory observation, where we joined different people on their daily routine of their daily transport routines, so we could see what is their experience in transportation sector. And with all this knowledge, we brought it together in different planning structures and frameworks. And then the political and planners could together decide on some measures and concepts they want to partake. So that's the political integration. And third, we have the sectoral integration. And we already talked about how important it is to include mobility next to infrastructure and traffic planning. Yeah, of course, it's still really important to look at the infrastructure and to look at the traffic, because they themselves also influence mobility. So when we talk about sectoral integration of transportation planning, it's about to viewing together the different approaches infrastructure, traffic, and mobility planning gives to us, and also outside of the transportation sector with spatial structure, environment, but also economy or social planning. They are also really important for the transportation sector. So a sectoral integration would try to establish a cooperation between these different planning fields and try to work out integrated or sectoral integrated plans and strategies. Here's one good and bad example. I want to show you how important the sectoral integration is to get a really successful goal or achieve the goals. And the first example is the campaign Kopf an, Motor aus. It's translated to brain on, motor off. And it was from the Ministry of Environment. And they were trying to influence the mobility behavior. So we would argue a classical mobility planning concept. And this was also really huge. It was a lot of, in a lot of German cities. It was all over the place. So everyone could see it. And it had also really in-depth psychological behavior models, was like different phases. So it was a huge thought out campaign and concept. But in the end, it also got evaluated, has no effect on urban traffic. And of course, afterwards, we can see at the same time, they were building new streets, they were improving the highway infrastructure. Why should people change their mobility behavior? And when the one concept works in this direction, but the infrastructure projects and traffic planners were improving the ways of coming by car. So there we can see that these different sectors or this different planning fields work against each other. A better example would be the congestion tax in Stockholm. There we have the implementation of the toll charging station for the inner city in Stockholm. And they combined it with strategic improvement way before they even did this congestion tax of the public transport sector, but they also have like different mobility workshops. They had like different campaigns. They even had a public referendum after the pilot. So it was a really integrated approach from a lot of different planning sectors, transport, infrastructure, social planners that all work together to create this whole concept. And then in the end, we there have a ecological and more social, accommodable transport system. And this example shows if different sectors work together on a common goal, of course, it's way easier to achieve this goal. And lastly, we have the spatial integration. There it's about working together. I already were telling you about this problem in climate planning and climate change, that it's no point when only one country has no CO2 emissions, but the neighboring country just doubles the CO2 emissions. And we have the same problems with transport. If one municipality is maybe car-free, but the next one doubles the cars and they drive all through this municipality, the problems are not solved. So we always have to think cross-border. We have to think about in cooperation, how we can cooperate with our neighbors instead of competition. And that's a huge problem on a nation level, but also on a regional and local level, that the different spatial areas don't compete with each other, but more think in terms of cooperation, how we can create sustainable transport systems and sustainable transport project so that we can have a functioning system. And one way or one goal would be to have a supranational or supra-regional institutions that coordinate this approach. For example, with the European Union, we have this kind of approach in Europe, where different countries work together on a level above. But we also could argue that in international relation, it would be the United Nations that could fill such role. But we always need one actor that is kind of above this different regions so that they can start to coordinate. And there we also have two examples for this cross-border coordination. One is in the EU, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. You maybe heard from them. They are implemented in a lot of countries in Europe. And there are like a planning structure, how different regions can accommodate for their problems, for their urban and transportation problems, and how they can interconnect and coordinate between each other. So it's a spatial flexible framework for mobility planning. And another example is from Germany, this time on a more regional level. Here we have a federal state, North Rhine-Westphalia, that are working together with different regions to create a coordinated approach with public transport, but also with training and communication. They also do a lot about communication campaigns about mobility, and they also train new mobility managers, new mobility planner. So this is, for example, a really good example in Germany for institutionalized network, how we can plan mobility. So, and with this 4 integration levels, in my opinion, we can achieve a better transport sector future. So what we can sum up this whole lecture is that integration of mobility planning in the classical transportation-oriented planning has still a long road ahead. So in most of the countries around the world, mobility is not a huge factor in transportation planning. But, and that's, I hoped I could show you that it offers a lot of new possibilities and new unparalleled solutions to tackle the challenges when we start to not only look at the traffic, but also on the traffic related decisions. So what comes before, and that is the mobility. So 3 last points. First, we need to evaluate how we think about transportation and especially include the human being in our solutions. And I think that's one simple point, but it's so hard to approach us in the engineering practices. So every one of us has to evaluate how his plans, his ideas, how his strategies accommodate for the human being. And secondly, that I hope I also showed you that mobility is really complex. Yeah, it's not easy to understand. It's not easy to measure. And that's why it's important that we generate knowledge how we can understand mobility, but also knowledge how we can influence mobility. So we knew the classical transportation planners and engineers oftentimes don't have this knowledge. So in future, and we do this in our lectures at the university, that the next generation of transportation planners has this knowledge what mobility is and how they can shape it or how they can plan it, so that they can start to implement it. And last, we have integrated transportation planning, the concept I showed you with the 4 integration levels. And this is also the solutions, how we can integrate mobility into the transportation planning and also reduce the negative impacts of traffic, but by improving mobility. So we have a higher mobility and a lower traffic, so that the negative impacts of the traffic are better in the future. And I hope you could learn something from my presentation. I think it's a really new and interesting way to look at the transportation sector. All of us have a long road ahead to tackle these challenges we have in transportation. And that's why I'm glad I could speak to you today and show you some of our concepts we did. But I also would like to see what other planners, what other thinkers do in this direction, so we can all together in the end shape the transport system for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Can you remove your slides so we can see the 3? Yes, exactly. Okay. So thank you very much, Alex, for this presentation. I think it's we have about half an hour for discussion. It's a very good framing of the whole thing. Maybe as a start, can you say something about your training a little bit? You know, I wondered, you have an interdisciplinary approach, you want to link technology and humans and all that. How does one get to such an approach in terms of training?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think my way was quite unusual. I started in bachelor with a classical transportation engineer. So I'm also, my final degree is also transportation engineering. But in my master's, I started to focus more on the planning side. So I started at the transportation engineering. Then with my master's studying, there was a stronger focus on also on the planning and the political side of things. And then I started my career at the chair of integrated transport planning, and there is the narrative to think interdisciplinary. And that's why also my colleagues, I think I'm the only transportation planning engineer there. The rest of them are urban planners, psychologists, environmental planners. So we have a broad team of totally different views on the transportation sector. And I think it's a huge improvement when we talk about different strategies and different concepts, that we have so many different perspectives. And that's also the sectoral integration I was talking about. I would wish that also in administration, so in the planning practices, that there also are different perspectives, that not only the infrastructure planners are there, but they are sitting together with different mobility planners or sociologists or something like that. And that's influenced my approach, that I'm coming from this engineer perspective. I understand also the engineer perspective. I think it's really helpful also for me to understand this different approach, but I learned new perspectives and could use them to create, in my opinion, better solutions.
I think this fits very well with, what we try to do in IGLUS.
Yeah,
we really believe in interdisciplinarity. We love technology. That technology is needed, but technology needs to be there for a purpose. It's not a goal in itself. Yeah. It's a tool for something, and you put the people into the center. And so it's really interdisciplinary and transsectoral. So I think that your presentation fits very well into our approach. Yeah. Now, I think we have a series of questions to you, but I don't know, Umut, you want to start? And, we can easily fill half an hour, don't worry. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have my first question is about the constraints. I mean, that you advise there needs to be like a paradigm shift towards mobility rather than classic transport planning. And going there, what are the biggest constraints for you? I mean, you think?
Yeah, not everybody loves this.
Yeah. No, one of the big constraints we personally, because we work also together with local administration, so we're not only science, but also have this practical approach. And one of the huge constraints is the knowledge, not the knowledge about mobility, but the knowledge about planning mobility. So a lot of planners are classical transportation engineers, and they only learned in their 20 or 30-year history where they were studying, they learned about infrastructure building and some basic methods how they plan, but they don't learn about participation. That was a huge problem 10 years ago when the European Union made some new laws on participation. Now all the transport engineers had to talk with the people, but they didn't knew how they should do that. So there was huge problems with participation. So that's, I think, is one major constraint, is to empower the local planners to think interdisciplinary, to learn these new methods. And I think, that's the one of the major constraints. Then another one is, it's also dependent on training, but it's also a cultural way of thinking. For example, I see always the difference between, for example, United States and in Germany. In Germany, it's a traditional planning culture, planning tradition of hierarchical decision making. And for example, in the United States, but also in Scandinavia, it's a totally different planning culture that's way more open to participation and to interacting with people, also in transportation. And I think that's in many different countries, they have different planning cultures. And so every planning or every decision maker has to ask themselves, what is the dominant planning culture at their place, and how this concept can fit in this planning culture. So that I would argue are the two major constraints for this approach to integrated planning.
Okay, let me follow on this, Umut, and then I come back to you. I mean, since you were talking about culture, I wanted to ask this question rather at the end, but let's add, I mean, Germany, you're from Germany, you know, and it's a car country.
Yeah.
You produce cars, you know, and it's part of the German identity, maybe a little bit exaggerated, but there are others. They're not, you know, the US, the French, you know, the only one. But sort of, how do you, you know, I wondered, and that's an IGLUS topic, you know, I wonder how, you know, I mean, the mobility, it's more like an urban concept, you know, and the car is a national or at least lender specific economy, you know. Is that, do you perceive some sort of tension between, you know, what the country wants and then what the people, who most of them live in the cities, want?
Yeah, first, of course, planning is always about tension. If you don't have tension, then you live in a technocracy, as where there is no difference in opinion and everyone thinks the same. So it's quite usual to have different perspectives and to have these tensions. And for example, with the car-oriented culture, and that's of course a major part that influences also decision making, not only the personal mobility, but also for political decision makers, how they make their decisions. That's why it's important to have this normative integration, that we don't start at the car and think about, okay, how we can save this sector or how we can improve car mobility. Instead, we should think about what is the major goal. What should be, for example, livable cities, but for the rural community, it could also be connectivity, that they have not as much problems reaching grocery stores, for example. So now we have frameworks, normative frameworks, and then we can think about what is the right strategies to tackle that. And for the example, for the rural population, you could argue, okay, now they all need car access so that they can drive to the supermarket. The innovative idea would be maybe the supermarket could be the mobile part, and he drives through different villages, so it's not dependent on the car. And with this example, I want to show you it's not to think first about the measures or the concepts, but first at the goals. And maybe you find new solutions, new innovative ideas, how this solution could be tackled, like a mobile supermarket. Now, people that can't drive cars anymore. There's a huge problems also in Germany, in the rural areas where we have elderly people don't want to drive cars, and they have huge problems to get the basic needs fulfilled. And then would be such a concept like a mobile supermarket or different approaches would solve the solution. So in the end, of course, every country has its own cultural views, especially on mobility, because everyone of us takes part in transportation and mobilities and spends a lot of lifetime in his transportation modes. But I think if we generate a level of understanding between political decision makers and the citizens, then we can also bring forth some ideas. But of course, in the practice, one example would be in Germany, the speed limit. It's proven so many times that it's more safe and more environmental friendly, and it's still not comes through the legislative part of the political system. So we can see, of course, these cultural identities have still a strong influence of transport decision making. But I would say, as longer as we talk about this over the years, the resistance will start to crumble, and then we can implement also innovative ideas.
You may laugh, but in Switzerland we had a car party, a political party which was called the car party, you know, to defend, and that was the objective. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was quite powerful politically. So.
Yeah, we have the same in Germany. I think in a lot of countries we have, of course, a political representation of car-oriented policies. But also there we have to look behind it. It's really about the car, or is there something else? It's more about freedom of movement or opportunities. That of course the car gives us a lot of opportunities, and especially in the rural sector, and maybe the car is the best alternative. So the politics should also not be against one kind of transport mode, but should look at the whole picture, look at where it fits best. Maybe for rural populations, the car is really the best alternatives, but for city not that much. So we need different approaches for different regional structures.
Yeah, that's what I also like, with your approach, and it's very much like IGLUS. It's pragmatic. It's not ideological. We need to respond to the needs and what is the best solution collectively.
Yeah, that's really important. And with the integrated transportation approach, that it's not dependent on one normative or ideological framework, because we would argue maybe in 10 years, 20 years, we have totally different challenges, and the challenges change over the time, and that's quite normal. But the systems, how we implement this normative goals with concept, that should stay progressive, and that's the integrated transportation planning, but it's not dependent on sustainable, progressive, or ideological views.
Umut, you want to continue, or?
I mean, coming to this, this mobility, transport planning, I think I can say, there was a trend until the pandemic, like, or global trend, cycling, walking, public transport. Cars seem to be losing. But it's very early to tell, but do you think the pandemic, there seems to be a trend of returning to cars right now? Do you think there will be a permanent effect after the pandemic in terms of?
Of course, it's a little bit too early to get to some conclusion, but I think maybe it's ambivalent. So, of course, on the one hand, we have an increase, especially in the first unsecured time frames where people were falling back more to cars, and we still see an impact on the public transportation sector. But for example, in Germany and especially in Berlin, we also saw a huge increase in bicycle. So, and also we got this pop-up bike lanes, new approaches to planning. Maybe you also heard from it for Germany. It was really unusual. Before, it took like 4 or 5 years to get bicycle infrastructure. In the pandemic, there were now, in 1 month, they built a temporary bicycle infrastructure. So you could see that there was the planners was taking the challenges and creating solutions that helped also the environmentally friendly modes of transport. On the end, we have to look at the broader pictures. Of course, the major impact on mobility, in my opinion, is not the increased car traffic or the reduced public transport traffic, but it's more about home office and working from home. And as you could see in my presentation, that's one huge part. When maybe 10% of the population only drives to car or goes to work every day, but works from home. This has a huge impact on the transportation sector. And in my opinion, this is a chance we can use in transportation planning to improve working from home, to reduce the travel times many of us have to spend in traffic. So I think you could also view this crisis as a chance that the new ideas, new concepts like home office, but also for travel, for business travel, that we have a lot of more meetings online right now. So instead, maybe would be traveling to some other city in Europe, but now we are speaking all from home. So this also has impact on the transport sector, and I believe even when everything will be fine again, we still will have these consequences from people adapting to meeting online, to working from home, and this will also have consequences for transportation.
Alex, there is a concept you have not used at all, which is multimodality. Is a concept that the European Union uses very much.
Yeah.
What can you? Is there a problem with that, or is it just from what I hear, you know, multimodality and mobility is very, very similar, isn't it?
Yeah, multimobility or multimodality is, for me, it's a concept. So again, like all these different concepts we talk about, is a measure to reach some goals, and maybe some goals are best suited for multimodality. But most of the time, when you speak with people, nobody likes switching transport modes all the time. It's not a really approved concept by the people. So for me, it's a classical engineering problem. Of course, with Google Maps, for example, you can see that sometimes when you switch a lot of times to transport modes, you maybe are faster. So for me, this is the extent of multimodality, that you give the users the information. And I myself saw it when Google Maps introduced that the bicycle now is also shown when you how fast you would be if you take the bicycle first and then switch to different modes of transport. And because I was using bike sharing, I could use this information and decide then to take the bike. But as you can see, that's a really small group. That's you have to have a lot of transport options, like sharing options, etc. That's a really small urban group. And still, everyone would prefer to just, maybe sit in the car from work and drive home to his front door, or sit in the bus or metro from work and just drive at home. So I think multimodality is not a goal in itself. That's why it's so important to differentiate, but could be a measure in some places to reach the goals of better connectivity. When we talk about connecting the rural areas to the city areas, today we have like park and ride concepts. I think that's good concepts, but they're on a concept level. They are not the criteria or goal for itself.
Good. Yeah. I see your point.
I have one more question. It's just maybe a little bit personal, because for my master's I was doing some research for these urban transport authorities. And I mean, in Germany there is this layers, regional transport authorities, these VVRs, I think. And you are already doing research on different countries. You use the case for France.
Umut, I can't hear you.
No?
Speak up.
You cannot hear me?
I can hear you, Umut.
Okay. Maybe now?
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the question is about these VVRs, these regional transport authorities in Germany. Do you think, I mean, having a layer like that, because it's not in the case in every country,
it's a federalist, typical federalist thing. Yeah.
And do you think it is producing better results for cities? I mean, having that layer, or is it like, it's like a waste of time? I don't know.
An additional complexification of the whole thing.
So in principle, I think it's makes more complication in the first place. That's why I have such a strong emphasis also on this force integration level, on the spatial integration, because it's how you already told that this is a huge problem in Germany. And for example, I want to make an example with Berlin. So we have Berlin, this own federal state, like a state in the United States, and Berlin is surrounded by another state, Brandenburg, and they tried to fuse this both state, but this failed and in a public referendum. And we now still have this both states. One is mainly rural, another one is highly urban, and the outer one is completely surrounding the inner one. And there we have huge problems for integrated planning, that the bus don't stop at the borders from the city to the next authority. And of course, there were like concepts like regional transport agency that also work its approach. But I think in the first place, it makes things complicated. But also when I look at other countries, and France is a prime example for this, because it's highly unified or unitary state, they most of the time I see they still have the same problems we have, and sometimes even worse. So again, it's ambivalent. I couldn't argue if it's federalism is better or worse for integrated transportation planning, but you definitely need to accommodate for that. So in one example, I was showing you the Zukunftsnetz in Nordrhein-Westfalen, the federal state in Germany, and they have a really good approach to getting these regional actors together. And the same we could think about, we make on a German level, but we are not at this point yet. But I think you could improve from here. And in other cases where we have unitary systems, like in France, you need different approaches. There you need a little bit different concepts. There maybe it's not about as much regional coordination. There it's more about political participation. So they have more problems to connecting to the people, to the local problems, and integrating them. So each system has pros and cons. And when you make strategies or planning processes, you have to accommodate for these problems.
You briefly mentioned SUMPs, Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans from the European Commission.
Yeah.
This is a big initiative to sort of get a little bit bottom-up initiative into this whole thing, you know. What do you think about, what is the potential of this? It's a nice exercise, or will it really make a difference? What have you seen?
No, I think the sustainable urban mobilities are quite promising, and also are the first framework that includes many of these integration levels I was talking about. The funny thing is that they are totally or mostly unknown in Germany, because they are quite a huge thing all around Europe. But Germany, because we have this strong conservative transport planning culture, and also political and power structures that support its own reproduction, it still has a hard time to get into Germany. But I think it's a really good approach, and we can build on this basis, especially the political integration part, but also the sectoral integration. It's in the name, urban mobility, so it's combining the urban planning with mobility planning and transport planning. So I think that this is a future framework we could implement in Europe. But of course, because it's so informal, some countries, just Germany, just ignore it and make their own thing. So in future, I would try to make it more like law binding, and get a regulative or legislative framework on the European level to bring countries to implement more of this stuff in their own regions. Yeah. But I think it's a quite promising concept.
Yeah, it's another discussion, and we have it. But of course, for Europe, it's very difficult, you know, to bypass the nation states and go down to the cities. I think that's the kind of problems you see. Okay, now I have three more. You know, the next one is a little bit critical. You never. I mean, you implicitly you talk, but you never talk about cargo, about freight. You know, you talk about people, but a lot of the mobility problems result from all these trucks, all this freight, all this. You know, do you have something to propose also to the? I mean, your idea of bringing the food trucks to the people instead of driving to the supermarket. We actually had that very early on. You know, it was removed by the. But you know, there's a big problem is freight. What do you do with freight?
Yeah, of course, that's also a huge part in the transport planning fields, and especially when it's like this urban freight delivery, for example. I would also say it's part of the urban transportation planning. But I would still make a difference between logistic, like global logistics, and what I call mobility planning, whereas really it's about the human. But if it's like ordering pizza, then of course it's also part of mobility planning because you induce traffic in this. Yeah, but I would argue that's also a field of transportation planning, logistics, and they also have to work on the major framework. So every sector has to reach its sector goals in climate, but also in social responsibility, etc. But I would argue against the total integration of all of these parts into one field of work. So I would not wish for a transport planner who does logistic, who does infrastructure building, who does traffic management, who does mobility planning. I would argue it has to be sectoral integrated, so they have to speak to each other and coordinate with each other, but still we need expertise in all of these different fields, but they have to also learn to work together. But of course the logistic planner has to learn about participation processes as much as maybe the mobility planner. So I think we can differentiate here on a concept level, on a measure level, but on the goal level, on a goal criteria level, there we meet again to work together to achieve the common goals.
Very good, very good. Okay, now one thing, Umut, we have 5 more minutes. We have a few more minutes, or
maybe 5 more.
Okay,
because it's already 1.5 hours.
Yeah. But one thing we are facing, I think, I liked very much your introduction. The critique of all this and the techno-fix kind of things. And one thing I'm observing is, okay, now let's do mobility. So they take the concept of mobility. You want to give it a human touch, or you want to make it human-centric. But for many people, I see this is technocentric. Mobility is smart mobility.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Exactly as you say, it's flying cars and all these digital everything, self-organizing systems and everything. I mean, it's a little bit a rhetorical question, but how can you prevent that? The concept of mobility will be hijacked by all these people who just love technology and forget the people. I mean, the new artificial intelligence, blockchain mobility, I don't know what, artificial intelligence mobility will fix it by itself. What do you respond to these people?
Yeah, so first I have to argue that I don't have the problem with the technology. I think the new e-scooters, opposed to many other transport planners, I think they are not a problem. I use them. They are now part of my space of opportunity. For me, they increased my opportunities. So the technology itself can be really useful, but it's not about the engineers and the corporations to decide what is the mobility system. So this is a classical state quest or for the urban planners. So they can't let private like organizations or private companies, and we had the same problem with the rental bikes, the Chinese rental bikes we had in a lot of European cities. So the cities or the decision makers have to take their point, their goals, and then look, okay, how this different technology can help me achieve these goals. But the technology itself, and especially we have this with autonomous driving, the technology itself is not the goal. So it's about thinking first, and the companies don't have to do that. It's not their major goal. They are there for making profit and creating new technologies. But for decision makers, for planner, they have to think in terms of people and future-proofing the societies. And their technology can help us, but it also has problems, and that's why we need the knowledge first to know, okay, do we even want flying taxis all over the cities, or maybe this is also a problem for the living qualities. And Of course, sometimes we still have politicians, and in Germany too, who think, oh, nice, flying taxis is a new economic sector, and they think in economic and technology-oriented terms, but not as much as in planning terms and future-proofing society and the state as a whole.
Good, very, very good. At the end, I wanted to ask you, does the name of Ivan Illich tell you something?
Yeah, I think I heard him, but I can't connect the exact teams.
You know, the concept of counterproductivity. I just wanted, you know, your critique. It's mostly about the car, you know, but 1970s. Okay, so hippie time. But I think there is something to that concept that can be used. So the idea really is, the car is gonna destroy itself. You know, you're more transport will make everything slower. Okay, so people have more transport opportunities, and at the end, they move less fast than if they had a more simple solution. So I still think that kind of critique, you know, of making things counterproductive, too much of a good thing, you know, makes the whole thing bad.
Yeah, that's also hugely connected with the rebound effect, and building more car lanes and just produces or induces more traffic. But it comes back to the same problem, that it's all end-of-pipe strategies that, of course, I can talk about the car or about different infrastructures, but when we talk, and with the one slide I was talking about goals, mobility and transport-oriented goals. So look at why we need more cars, or why people want more cars, because they want to get faster to their destinations, or they want to live outside of the city. And both of these problems I could also tackle with different approaches. So in the end, it's again, we planners have the tools and the instrument to shape it. And if people still want to buy cars and drive cars, it's not the problem of the people, it's the mistakes we did in planning. So it always comes back to the planning.
Good, excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, I think we can finish.
But I think it's a very good it's a very good overview. It's a very clear perspective. You know, technology is good, but it's a tool. It's not.
Yeah. That's the important part. Nothing is only negative or only positive. And,
Exactly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
You know, hopefully one day we will do physical IGLUS and we will see you again.
Yeah, I would hope that too. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your lecture. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.